The modern competitive player is besieged by fire types wherever they go. VGC has long since been dominated by Incineroar to the point of it becoming synonymous with the format, whereas several of the Pokemon too powerful for singles have been fires, from Chi-Yu to Gouging Fire, and with Terrestrialization, even Pokemon that aren't fire types often get in on the fun, most famously Koraidon. Fire types have been part and parcel of the competitive landscape for a long time now, but this wasn't always the case. They used to be deemed as lesser gimmicks, insufficiently reliable for the highest level of play. So today we're exploring how Pokemon saved the fire type, taking it from its lowly origins to today's fire-friendly competitive landscape. In the first generation, fire types were about as far from metagame mainstays as you could get. They didn't fit into the psychic and normal dominated Gen 1 OU metagame. Sure, they could threaten something like Jynx or Exeggutor, but they'd also get completely stonewalled by the ubiquitous Starmie or Chansey, which was a problem given how difficult it was for them to switch in. In Gen 1, fire didn't even resist ice, meaning Pokemon like Moltres and Charizard were actually weak to the blizzards tossed around every corner. And of course, the fact that fire wasn't even super effective against the ice types Cloyster and Lapras sure didn't help. Fire types weren't even second rate. They were so third rate to the point where they couldn't even impact the water heavy UU. To use fire types in standard play was pretty much a sign that you weren't ready for competitive, as you were too attached to using your in-game favorites. This wasn't exclusive to Gen 1 either, being a feature of the first several generations, but this is best exemplified in how Charizard is well and truly useless in OU, yet has plenty of trainers trying to make it work because, well, it's Charizard. Suffice to say, they give up on this Sisyphean task quite quickly. It's not just that fires have less going for them so early on, though yes, this is also a major factor. The coverage of Fire Stab, that is their bread and butter, isn't particularly effective at a time where there aren't even steel types. Fire Blast actually has a 30% burn rate in Gen 1, which sounds amazing until you realize that burn only does 6.25% damage per turn, which isn't bad, but does mean you can't inflict paralysis, whose 25% full para rate is effectively a damage boost for most offense and is far more efficient than the pardon the pun, very slow burn of such minimal per turn damage. Chansey, Starmie, and Alakazam actually welcome getting burned. Oh, there's also the fact that using fire moves actually undoes Gen 1's devastating effective one-hit KO permanent freeze, a status that is much more effective and comes from much better Pokemon. That's the other part. Beyond fires having less to offer, the fire types themselves are thoroughly meager. This continued into Gen 2. At least Belladrum Charizard had a pretty cool OU niche this time around, but it was incredibly specific and rare. The same went for the alternative pursuiter Houndoom. While faster and stronger than Tyranitar and Umbreon, it was much rarer than these two because ultimately, its frailty severely limited what it could offer, and its power wasn't all that. Even the introduction of the Steel type didn't help here, when Fire still struggled to switch in and get past unmovable walls like Snorlax and Suicune. The addition of Hidden Power for grass coverage didn't really help here at all, as it just wasn't strong enough, and the fact that Entei was so much worse than his fellow legendary beasts to the point of uselessness certainly didn't help the perception of fires as lesser. Neither did the new Fire-type starter Typhlosion, being an ineffectual Charizard copy, but even Ho-Oh had regular conversations about dropping it down to OU, as it certainly wouldn't be more broken than Snorlax, and its fire typing wasn't exactly its main strength. If anything, it provided one of its few exploitable weaknesses by making it quadruple weak to Rock Slide. What was nuts about Ho-Oh was its stats alongside 32 PP recovery and a Spikes immunity. Even its signature Burn Happy Stab Sacred Fire didn't go very far with 8 PP and rest users around every corner. Gen 3 continued largely in this vein, though there were some major changes that would pay off for fires down the line. First and foremost, the shift away from the maxed out EV system of the first two gens, as well as the addition of natures, potentially boosting stats even further, meant that Pokemon were doing much more damage on average, and this would be key for the fire types as well, firepower, to actually translate to big damage, especially with the newly added Overheat. Additionally, the increased emphasis on passive damage, multiple layers of spikes, Tyranitar's permanent Sandstorm, meant the game played at a faster, more immediate pace, even when not trading in direct damage, which had also generally increased. This more widespread direct damage is also why fires were looked down on for so long, though even offensive Pokemon were still expected to pull their weight defensively, and fires offered nearly nothing in this regard, without having the lights out speed of a Starmie or Aerodactyl to compensate for it. Even the fires that did offer some utility, like Camerupt, continued in the tradition of fires just not having the stats to really stand up to OU. Offensively, they had quite a few things to like. Now, Blaziken as the Skarm Bliss Buster had its fans, while some players enjoyed the insane power Charizard was capable of after using Sunny Day, then substituting down to activate the special attack boosting Pataya Berry and its Blaze ability, but ultimately, such offense wasn't consistent enough to make up for how greatly Fire struggled against OU's waves of Surfs, Rock Slides, and Earthquakes, with a particularly nasty weakness to Dugtrio, and if you were Earthquake and Doug immune, you became Thunderbolt weak as well. Basically, Fires were pretty cool gimmicks on occasion, but if you expected your opponent to use one, they were no longer worth using, and the fact that they so thoroughly struggled with such staples in Salamence and Tyranitar meant you'd often be fighting an uphill battle. Now, sometimes earlier generations are inspired by later gens, and Moltres' rehabilitated image in the first 3 generations is perhaps the finest example. In those early days where Fires were thought of as gimmicks, Moltres was definitely one of the better ones, if not the best, but still a gimmick, not to be brought to serious play. However, after Fires exploded in viability in the later gens, players were inspired to take another look at Moltres in the early generations, and in doing so, wound up seriously improving its standing. Fires as a whole were still limited for all the aforementioned reasons, but Moltres became the exception. In Gen 1, its Fire Blasts were tied for the strongest special attack in the game, out-damaging even Mewtwo's Psychic, and it combined this peerless power with the 30% burn rate that actually worked to its advantage when combined with its partial trapping Fire Spin, which basically functioned as a flinch move and let it potentially wear down Starmie and Chansey before finishing them off with its solid base 100 attack Hyper Beam. With agility, it cleaned up late game and it even destroyed Tauros one-on-one. Meanwhile, in Gen 2, Moltres became renowned for its ability to potentially 2-hit KO King Snorlax with Charcoal and Sunny Day boosted Fire Blast, which also smashed through the newly dominant offensive teams with ease, while Sun would also cut the accuracy of the legendary Electric Thunders down to 50%. Most impressively though, in advance, Moltres was such a furious attacker alongside Sand and Spikes that it legitimately reshaped the metagame. It became so common that teams weak to it were no longer acceptable, which was major considering how it obliterated such significant portions of the tier that were often paired together, like Metagross, Celebi, Magneton, and Heracross, and thus invalidated a great many teams whose special sponges were Snorlax and were thus completely ruined by its Will-O-Wisp. This wasn't something you could just brush off as a gimmick or too rare to bother accounting for, as Moltres rose to OU, becoming a legitimate part of the tier. This paved the way for Charizard's talents to be explored further, and more reliable sets emerged that established themselves among the best wall breakers in the tier thanks to its great base 100 speed and anti-blissey tactics like Focus Punch and Beat Up. Zard 2 rose to OU. Fire types became the real deal in Gen 3, after the fact. It's worth noting that, though they were also the best equipped in terms of stats and move pool, Zard and Moltres were also both immune to Earthquake, Dugtrio, and even Spikes, which helped them bypass the greatest hindrances to the other Fires, echoing the 4th generation, where everything changed for Fires as a whole. To Charizard's chagrin, Generation 4 added Stealth Rock, knocking it down to NU, where Moltres dropped to UU. It would seem that rocks were yet another thorn in the side of Fire types that would keep them from playing on an even field with Tyranitar and company. But everything changed here with the introduction of Heatran and Infernape. It also helped that they were reaping the benefits of other Gen 4 additions like Choice Specs, Choice Scarf, Life Orb, and Close Combat, but none of this would have been of any use if they weren't so well designed. They were no longer overlooked after the fact stars. These were the first current generation Fire types that defined the metagame just as much as anything else, which was one of the reasons Generation 4 felt like such a new era. Having Fire Stab launch so regularly was a major departure from the first 3 generations. The fact that both Heatran and Infernape were Stealth Rock neutral was, of course, immeasurably important, but that wasn't the only reason they were so far beyond all the Fires that had come before. Infernape's speed wasn't just better than Blaziken's, it was incredible in its own right, genning past not just the defining base 100 speed tier, but even Garchomp while it was in the tier, and even beyond that, its move pool was tremendously rich. Meanwhile, Heatran was even slower than Blaziken, but its secondary Steel type along with Flash Fire gave it an absolute ton of resistances, and it was incredibly bulky. This meant that Heatran was the first defensive Fire type, an inconceivable concept for the first 3 generations even now. Of course, it was also a tremendous offensive force with a special attack set that eclipsed even Moltres. Fire types were certainly more in number in the lower tiers too. In UU, you had Moltres, Arcanine, Houndoom, and Blaziken, who were all excellent, while Entei had a strong niche as well, but the Fire type was here to stay in OU. Plus, Plus, even Gen 3 Moltres and Charizard, strong though they were, couldn't match the consistency and ease with which Heatran and Infernape were placed on teams. For a long time after the bans of Latias and Salamence, Heatran was the most used Pokemon in OU for how well it slotted on any type of team. Heatran and Infernape were so good, they even saw play in Ubers, especially Heatran, which was also a first. Not one, but two fires not named Ho-Oh that could hang with Kyogre and company. As a side note, when Arceus was allowed, its fire form became the second fire type Uber, but it didn't actually see use over its other forms. Meanwhile, as modern VGC came into existence, ill-documented though much of it was, Heatran, Infernape, and eventually Ho-Oh established fire as a powerful presence there as well. If Gen 4 had saved the fire type, Gen 5 and onward would ensure that everything else needed saving from the fire type. Heatran and Infernape were strong, but balanced. With Gen 5, fires went berserk. It wasn't just new fires either. Blaziken's previous speed woes were fixed, and then some, through gaining speed boost as an ability, which promptly launched it to destroy OU so fully, it became the first starter Pokemon banned to Ubers, and for that matter, the first fire type to start in OU, and then get banned from it, as well as the first non-legendary fire type Uber. Meanwhile, Ninetales and his newly gained Drought wound up getting both Chlorophyll and Arena Trap banned down the line. Its Permasun was perhaps most famous for supporting non-fires with the menace of Venusaur in the Chlorosun days and the unstoppable Cresselia after Chloro was banned. But of course, it launched several fires to monstrous territory as well. Blaziken before it was banned, while Heatran was predictably extraordinary, Darmanitan and Victini launched some true face-melting attacks, and Quiverdance Volcarona was propelled to stratospheric heights. Like the continuously defining Heatran, however, which was most common and effective on sand teams, Volcarona hardly needed sun either. Gen 5's most iconic fire was notoriously such an automatic game ender, even in the face of its quadruple Stealth Rock weakness, that it fit beautifully on weatherless teams, sand teams, and yes, even rain teams, while many consistently called for it to join Blaziken and Ubers. Both Heatran and Volcarona would similarly thrive and dominate in VGC, where their heat waves had become one of the most iconic spread moves for the excellent coverage coming off of such astounding special attack stats. And these two also continued to excel in Gen 6, where permanent weather had been done away with altogether. This was, of course, a necessity when Mega Charizard Y was being introduced, especially as the fog was now an option for hazard removal, which meant that Quad Rock Week's Pokemon no longer required the potential to win the game on the spot, just like Volcarona, in order to justify their use. As in addition to Zard Y, the newly added Talonflame was excellent, but if the Quad Rocks weeks could get by, Mega Charizard X, with its singular Stealth Rock weakness after Mega Evolution, was even more frightening, especially as with Dragon Dance, it did possess that Volcarona-esque ability to sweep at the drop of a hat. There was also the fun little side effect of not knowing which Charizard form it was until it Mega Evolved, which was terrifying considering how different the answers to both forms were, and certain teams reveled in that ambiguity. Nothing like switching Latios into what looks like a certain Mega Charizard Y, only to get Dragon Clawed by a Zard X that fits just as well. Oh, and as a bonus, Heatran occasionally was used on Mega Zard Y teams, thus presenting opponents with the thoroughly unpleasant prospect of switching into Sun-fueled Heatran. Speaking of, the OU Fire situation had previously been the reliable Heatran and the more offensively geared Infernape, then Volcarona. Either way, OU had two reliable fire types. Now you had Heatran, Volcarona, two Mega Charizards, and Talonflame, and that was just XY. And Oraz, Volcanion, and its beautifully complementary dual fire-water stats hit the scene to really turn up the heat, and of course assist with taking opposing heat thanks to the quad resist. Indeed, fires were now regularly used as lines of defense against other fires. Previously, it just been Heatran, unique as the defensive fire, but now bulky defensive fires were, if not common, not uncommon either. In fact, bulky Talonflame was its most reliable option. With special defense investment and Roost, it countered Mega Charizard Y beautifully and completely dominated Volcarona, while burning would-be answers like Tyranitar and Landorus Therian with Will-O-Wisp. It was a similar story with the physically defensive Mega Charizard X. Volcarona could utilize Bulk and Roost en route to a Quiver Dance boost as well. Even Volcanion got in on the action despite lacking recovery, compensating with Protect so as to leverage its excellent defense. Of course, in VGC, fire types were all over the place. Mega Charizard Y, Talonflame, and Heatran most prominently. They were as defining an element of the format as anything else, and in Ubers and VGC 2016 alike, the ultimate fire fire type was Primal Groudon. Gen 7 continued to increase the fog distribution, making it easier than ever to keep rocks off for the fires. In fact, even bulky Mega Charizard Y with the fog and HP ground was used on certain teams. It'd never be a team's sole method of hazard control, but it sure shut the staple Stealth Rock Heatran down incredibly hard while beautifully answering opposing Mega Charizard Y. Make no mistake though, while non-Heatran bulky fires were now long since legit, the primary focus was still on offense. Fires were among the best users of Z moves, with all manner of infernal overdrives, regularly overwhelming through sheer strength. Z Magma Storm Heatran was so strong as to regularly elicit complaints of brokenness from the player base, while Z Fire Blast helped make Volcarona even more of a lights-out sweeper. In Ultra Sun and Moon, another new fire type joined the fray as well. And let's just say, Blacephalon was not going to be running bulky sets. It had not on its mind but unleashing as much of its brutal fire and ghost stab as possible, and it was tremendously well equipped for it, with base 107 speed that outran even Garchomp and a skyscraper base 151 special attack stat. In case that's not enough firepower for you, try this on for size. More Common Defog also enabled the newly effective Victini, used for its ability to act as an offensive check to the nearly uncounterable Tapu Lele, while also helping handle Magearna. Scarf Victini was a solid fit on many offensive teams. You know where else it fit? Those teams that paired Heatran with Mega Charizard Y had made a comeback, and as insane as it sounds, you could actually make a reliable team that fit all of Heatran, Megazard Y, and Victini, and managed to be defensively sound. And of course, there was no shortage of fire-type force, nothing like a sun-boosted V-Create. Of course, Gen 7 was infamously the moment where Intimidate Incineroar rolled into town and reshaped not just being a fire type in VGC, but VGC itself. To be a bulky fire was one thing, but this went beyond bulk to masses of utility for just about every conceivable situation. Fire types certainly didn't need saving by the time Gen 8 rolled around and added heavy-duty boots, but boy, did this ensure they were absolutely primed to unleash the full extent of their power. Not all fire action was boots related. Blaziken, no longer broken, returned to excellent effect, and Heatran was as good as ever, newly threatening that it could now unleash Eruption without being locked to a quiet nature, as it had been since receiving the move in the 4th generation event. However, the focus was largely on what boots unlocked. It may have lost Z moves and even hidden power, but a Volcarona you couldn't even partially check with Stealth Rock posed a uniquely terrifying threat. Additionally, defensive Volcarona was now incredibly legitimate. It excelled as an answer to many dangerous Kyurem sets before its ban. Boots were so good at unlocking the latent defensive potential of fires that Moltres, though it was UU, was a legitimately great OU Pokemon. Additionally, the removal of Pursuit meant that Blacephalon was newly free to spam its stabs without fear of getting trapped by the Tyranitar that was much less common to begin with. However, the greatest beneficiary of boots was, of course, the newly added Cinderace, which was a fire type that loved spamming U-turn, which it did without a care in the world as to whether Stealth Rock was up. It had stab on everything thanks to Libero, but its go-to weapon was the fire type Pyro Ball, which it used its great speed and attack to bombard teams with over and over until they collapsed, leading to its ban in both the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra, making it the second fire type and even second fire type starter to start in OU and get banned. Meanwhile, in VGC, Incineroar continued to fake out, intimidate, and generally cause a lot of grief. Now finally, the grand finale. Gen 8 OU's firepower was impressive for how easily the fires could unleash it thanks to boots, but power-wise, they weren't quite as overwhelming as Gen 7, with both Megas and Z moves running around. So to make up for that, Gen 9 added terrestrialization, so fire types could fire type even harder, or could turn into another type to facilitate their fire spamming through averting or bypassing the usual counterplay. This was at its most insane with Volcarona, which finally achieved that uber status that it had been flirting with since its inception, able to both ignore Stealth Rock and Terra's type shifting, allowing it to ruin its counters with absurd ease. It reduced OU to ashes. Terrestrializing also meant anything could be a fire type. For instance, Dragon Dance Kyurem could unleash vicious fire Terra Blast against Goldango, but we're sticking with original fires here. The days of Heatran dominating OU were past, though still maintaining a niche in standard play. But there were still plenty of fires occupying OU, with Libero nerfed, Cinderace return, still excellent, while Moltres rose to OU for the first time since Generation 3. Whereas it initially started dishing out massive hits, now it was taking them as one of OU's best defensive pieces, beautifully capping its redemption off. Additionally, the newly added Ceruledge primarily wielded its ferocious Sword Stance set, or it can even take the bulky fire in a new direction with a bulk up set, whose method of recovery is its unique fire stab Bitter Blade. Speaking speaking of new additions, not all of them lasted in OU. We partially mean Skeledirge, which brought the bulky fire to new heights with Unaware, but didn't last in OU as the DLCs expanded the decks, though it still maintained a niche. And it also has a niche in Ubers, staving off monsters like Koraidon and Zacian Crown, which is incredible. However, we mostly mean the two Pokemon that joined Volcarona in Ubers. Gen 9 banned as many different fires from OU as had previously banned total. The first was Chiyu, whose Beads of Ruin alongside a base 145 special attack let it launch some of the most over-the-top firepower yet. And the second was Gouging Fire, which took up the mantle as a sort of Neo Mega Charizard X, as its Dragon Fire Dragon Dance sets went berserk and landed at 2 suspect tests. The second of which it got canned. From being a sign that you were too attached to your starter Pokemon to regularly shattering OU, Game Freak did an excellent job at saving the fire type. And of course in VGC, Incineroar continues to reign supreme. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.